Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 25 April 2025. It is the 93rd anniversary of the birth of Nikolai Kardashev, who was born in Moscow 93 years ago on this date in 1932. At first sight, it may seem out of place for me to discuss Kardashev's work, but I hope you'll see the connection, which for me isn't marginal or peripheral, but rather central to any naturalistic conception of civilization, which is in turn central to any naturalistic conception of history. From the episodes in my Thought Experiments in Civilization series, you'll know that I sometimes apply lessons learned from philosophy of history to the study of civilization, and that I try to place the study of civilization in its cosmological context. So while Kardashev didn't himself write about philosophy of history, he did write about civilization, and in doing so, he placed civilization in a cosmological context. Kardashev, moreover, treated civilization in a completely naturalistic way, as have several astronomers engaged in SETI, or the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, some of whom I'll mention today, who looked at civilization from the point of view of natural science, not from the perspective of history, and not from the perspective of the social sciences, which has usually been the case when civilization comes into scientific focus. There are several historical sciences like anthropology and archaeology that occupy a gray area between natural science and social science. And anthropologists and archaeologists have been working, anthropologists and archaeologists have been among the most prolific contributors to understanding civilization. For example, in my recent episode on V. Gordon Childe, I talked about Childe's contributions to the study of prehistory and the earliest civilizations, which constituted a kind of archaeological foundation for the study of civilization. Several anthropologists also have made significant contributions to the study of civilization. Here, I particularly have in mind Robert Redfield and Milton Singer, but there are many others as well. Someday, I hope to talk more about how the various scientific traditions have contributed to the study of civilization, and more difficult to explain, how and or why these various contributions haven't come together into a viable science of civilization. But I'm going to leave that for another time. Today, being Kardashev's birthday, it's our opportunity to see what the physical sciences have contributed to the study of civilization. Probably everybody listening to this has heard of Kardashev's civilization types. It was in his 1964 paper, Transmission of Information by Extraterrestrial Civilizations, that he proposed his civilization types 1, 2, and 3. This was published only 5 years after the first paper on SETI by Cocconi and Morrison in 1959, titled Searching for Interstellar Communications. And it was this paper that effectively made it legitimate for scientists to openly discuss SETI and related matters. In an interview with Kardashev conducted by Bernard Oliver in 1981 and published in the volume SETI Pioneers, Kardashev acknowledged the influence of the Chaconian Morrison paper by sparking discussion about SETI. In an interview with Freeman Dyson in the same SETI Pioneers volume, Dyson also testified to the influence of the Cocconi and Morrison paper in being a springboard for discussion. Science fiction authors have been writing about these things for decades, but scientists were hesitant to get involved. And it's often the case that ideas like SETI and alien life and uploading minds into computers and exotic things like that are the things that stimulate public interest in discussion, which is, of course, one of the reasons why some scientists choose to keep their distance. In his interview that I mentioned previously, Dyson acknowledged that even after most of his professional scientific work had been forgotten, he would likely be remembered for his one-page paper on what had come to be called Dyson spheres, which he first proposed in 1960 in Search for Artificial Stellar Sources of Infrared Radiation. He's probably right about being remembered for Dyson spheres and not his other scientific work. I expect the same will be true for Kardashev and his civilization types, which will long outlast Kardashev's career in radio astronomy. Both Kardashev and Dyson were physical scientists, Kardashev a radio astronomer and Dyson a theoretical physicist, and both looked at civilization through the lens of the energy that it harnesses. Energy and its use by an intelligent agent is key to the SETI work of both Kardashev and Dyson. Kardashev's civilization types are based on the quantity of energy that a civilization can harness. This focus on energy can be and has been extrapolated backward in time to earlier periods of human history and even to before human history. In a 2017 paper by Olivia T. Judson, The Energy Expansions of Evolutions, she identifies what she calls 5 energetic epochs consisting of geochemical energy, sunlight, oxygen, flesh, and fire. Each new energy epoch brings the evolution of life forms that can exploit a new source of energy. Judson wrote, quote, I have sought to describe the stepwise construction of a life planet system. Using energy expansion as the lens reveals a fundamental recursive interplay between events in the evolution of life and the development of the planetary environment. Unquote. The last energetic epoch in her evolutionary sequence, fire, Judson subdivides into 2 stages. The first, the control of fire for cooking, and the second being a broader conception of fire that includes the use of fossil fuels and internal combustion engines in industrial technology. The second broader conception of the technologies of fire was grasped early in the Industrial Revolution by Sadi Carnot in his famous book, Reflections on the Motive Power of Fire, which developed a completely abstract conception of a steam engine as a thought experiment to understand the limits of an ideal heat engine. This short work was the basis of all of thermodynamics, and it was the abstract conception of thermodynamics that was the basis of Dyson's proposed technosignatures. Civilizations that use energy, even if they don't try to communicate, would still generate waste heat, hence the possibility of finding infrared signatures of cosmological scale energy use. We now recognize the energetic epoch of fire, as formulated by Judson, as the beginning of a new sequence of human energy regimes, and we could continue her energetic epochs through the stages of human civilization as human beings learn to harness forms of energy not previously exploited. Hunting and gathering uses human technology to derive energy from the environment in the form of food calories for human consumption. Farming is a much more intensive way to derive energy from the environment, still producing food calories for human consumption, but more efficiently and more effectively than hunting and gathering. The agricultural revolution, in other words, was at the same time an energy revolution. This is a very abstract way to look at the origins of human civilization, but it's exactly the kind of abstraction that you would expect from a natural scientific approach to civilization. Kardashev's civilization types represent further stages in an expanded account of energetic epochs. We just need to fill in the steps between the control of fire and the Type 1 civilization, which Judson has already sketched in her paper, though I should point out, I don't think Judson intended her work to be read in this way at all. Note that these stages in the development of energetic epochs, when it comes to the participation of intelligent agents, which Judson calls a fire creature, are stages of cultural evolutionism that we usually associate with Marx, and which I recently mentioned in my episode on V. Gordon Childe, since Childe was a Marxist and his account of human civilization was formulated in terms of cultural evolutionism. Also note that, once again, this is a purely naturalistic way to assimilate human development into a natural scientific framework. Just as Darwin established a continuity between the wider biosphere and human beings, the energetic epochs of Judson, and by extension, the civilization types of Kardashev established a continuity between pre-human energy expansions and energy expansions provided presided over by human beings. That is to say, human action is here continuous with nature. But the human all too human can also make its appearance in less helpful ways. I once said that Kardashev's civilization types have become a kind of Rorschach test, where the respondent in the test details their own depth psychology as they claim to be giving an exposition of some type of civilization. Since a great many people have written about Kardashev's civilization types, but few seem to have read his 1964 paper, and fewer still seem to have read his later papers. The far future of civilization is very much a focus of the projections of our own hopes and fears and anxieties. These projections of our hopes and fears of anxiety can be helpful if we recognize them for what they are, but they can also be a stumbling block. We project our hopes and fears onto the possibility of technologically advanced extraterrestrial civilizations because they may have started out as we are today, and we may become what they are now, if there are any such now. Dyson explicitly acknowledged a kind of complementarity, or if you like, what you could call a temporal symmetry between our understanding of our civilization today and our attempt to search for civilizations on a cosmological scale, since the civilizations that we would search for and which we would have any chance of finding would be greatly expanded and greatly elaborated versions of our own technological and industrialized civilization. Dyson wrote in his 1966 paper, The Search for Extraterrestrial Technology, quote, "When one discusses engineering projects on the grand scale, one can either think of that we, the human species, may do here in the future, or one can think of what extraterrestrial species, if they exist, may have already done elsewhere," unquote. We could call this Dysonian civilizational symmetry. Our present is the past of some more advanced civilization, or our future is the present of some more advanced earlier civilization. And their survival could imply our survival. Carl Sagan frequently observed that if we were to find a million-year-old super civilization in the universe, this would be proof of the concept that a civilization like ours can survive its apparently self-destructive impulses. And I alluded to this in my Thought Experiments in Civilization episode, In Search of Lost Civilizations. Sagan's enthusiasm for the idea of million-year-old supercivilizations unfortunately contributed to derailing what was valuable in Kardashev's natural scientific approach to civilizations in the universe. Sagan took up Kardashev's civilization types and combined them with a metric for information processing. Kardashev also came to focus on information processing, and in his 1971 paper, The Astrophysical Aspect of the Search for Signals from Extraterrestrial Civilizations, included in the collection of translated papers titled Extraterrestrial Civilizations, Problems of Interstellar Communication, edited by S.A. Kaplan, Kardashev gave what he called a functional definition of civilization as, quote, "a highly stable state of matter capable of developing survival reactions using data coded by the states of the individual molecules," unquote. Again, highly abstract. He returned to this idea in Strategy for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which was published in Acta Astronautica in 1979, in which he wrote, quote, "An essential difference distinguishing higher forms of life is their ability to abstractly analyze the collected information. In the course of the development of various forms of life, systems of living organisms reflecting this law also begin to play an important part in evolution. Using the definition of life given above, the following functional definition of a more advanced civilization can be proposed. A highly stable state of matter capable of collecting, abstractly analyzing, and using information for the purpose of acquiring qualitatively new information about its surrounding and itself, for self-improvement from the standpoint of possible acquisition of new information, and for the development of self-preserving reactions, which is uniquely distinguished by the amount of collected information, the program for its functioning, by its production for realizing these functions, unquote. Note that Kardashev's definition of civilization grows out of his definition of life. Again, this establishes a continuity that the methods of natural science can bridge, treating life and civilization uniformly. Sagan doesn't reference any of these other papers by Kardashev when he formulated his own taxonomy of civilizations based on information processing. We could see Sagan's revision of Kardashev, and indeed most of the discussions of Kardashev's civilization types, as being much like the subsequent discussion of V. Gordon Child's Urban Revolution paper, with its 10 diagnostic criteria for an urban revolution, still to this day being revised and adapted to define civilization, at least by archaeologists. So Sagan's revision of Kardashev seems innocent enough, but Sagan ended up distorting the scientific discussion of civilization by turning the discussion of Kardashev types into an excuse for the projection of our hopes and fears onto these civilizations. To explain how this happened, I need to talk about what's known as Goodhart's Law. Goodhart's Law was first formulated by the economist Charles Goodhart in 1975, such that, quote, any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed upon it for control purposes, unquote. This was later rendered in much more intuitive terms as, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. This is effectively what Sagan did to Kardashev's civilization types. He transformed them from a descriptive measure into a normative target. And with that transformation, Kardashev's civilization types ceased to be a good measure. Sagan took some of what's best in human nature, our longing and our striving to be better, but by applying it to civilization types and thus classifying human civilization as being short of type 1, he made attaining type 1 a civilizational target. I couldn't tell you how many discussions I've read in which the point of departure in the article is, when will we become a type 1 civilization, and what would it take to get us to the point of being a type 1 civilization? This transforms Kardashev's civilization types into an aspiration rather than a description, and in doing so, it distorts the discussion. Obviously, that's not what Sagan intended, but that's what it fed into. Insofar as we're interested in a purely naturalistic account of civilization, and this is what interests me, this transformation of civilizational types into an aspiration is effectively a repudiation of scientific naturalism. Again, that's not what was intended, but it's what it amounted to. And it's also clearly at variance with what Kardashev himself wrote in his 1964 paper. Here is Kardashev's original formulation of the 3 types of civilization he recognized. 1. Technological level close to the level presently attained on Earth, with energy consumption at 4 times 10 to the 19 erg seconds. 2. A civilization capable of harnessing the energy radiated by its own star. For example, the stage of successful construction of a Dyson sphere. Energy consumption at 4 times 10 to the 33rd erg seconds. 3. A civilization in possession of energy on the scale of its own galaxy, with energy consumption at 4 times 10 to the 44 erg seconds. There are a lot of ambiguities in these formulations. Of course, I'm reading the English translation. I don't read Russian, so I have to read the English translation of the paper, and it'd be interesting to know if those ambiguities are also present in the original Russian text. That's something I don't know. But in regard to the ambiguities, for example, there is an ambiguity of the Kardashev metric in terms of actual versus comparable energy uses. A carefully constructivist account of Kardashev would insist that a type 2 civilization is a civilization capable of harnessing the energy radiated by its own star, and that all of this energy must in fact come from that particular star and not from any other source. In other words, given a strict conception of a type 2 civilization, a civilization utilizing energy quantitatively equivalent to, but not identical to, the actual energy produced by a single star would not constitute a Type 2 civilization. Actual and equivalent energy use are very different measures. Kardashev himself uses both formulations, writing that Type 2 is energy radiated by its own star, while Type 3 is energy on the scale of its own galaxy, which is a formulation of equivalence that doesn't address any particular mechanism for the harnessing of energy. Moreover, in defining a Type 2 civilization as harnessing the energy radiated by its own star, Kardashev introduces an ambiguity due to the fact that there are stars of many different luminosities and temperatures. Generally speaking, the largest stars burn very hot, are very bright, and burn themselves out relatively quickly, while the small stars are much dimmer and endure much longer. Red dwarfs will likely outlast almost any other stars, and they would be the easiest to harness from a technological point of view. They're also the most common star, so a highly advanced technologically civilization might well have one near to hand, as it were. If we like, we could assume a standard star, and if we follow the principle of mediocrity, that standard star could be a star like the Sun, that is to say, a G-class star on the main sequence, even if these aren't the most common stars in the universe. In any case, all these ambiguities can be brushed aside because they don't really address what Kardashev was getting at. So what was Kardashev getting at? What was Kardashev trying to do with his civilization types? In the interview I referred to earlier, Freeman Dyson said of Kardashev's civilization types, quote, "His ideas about type 1, 2, and 3 civilizations are very reasonable. It gives one a language in which to talk about things on a large scale," unquote. That's what Kardashev was doing, talking about civilization on a large scale. As a radio astronomer and SETI scientist, Kardashev wanted a rough classification of civilizations that is relevant to detecting SETI signals through radio astronomy. He begins with type 1, which is, as he said, close to the present level attained on the Earth. I know this is a sticking point for a lot of people since Sagan's reformulation has become better known than Kardashev's original formulation. But as I said, Kardashev's classifications have a particular significance for technosignature detection. So type 1 is just us. That's the baseline. In formulating his baseline scenario of approximate present energy uses, Kardashev footnoted the book Energy in the Future by Palmer Coslet Putnam. Since I'm interested in this and I've been frustrated by the lack of engagement with what Kardashev actually wrote about his civilization types and not impressionistic accounts of these types by others, I got a copy of the book. It was published in 1953, right in the middle of the 20th century, and it discusses then current use and projections of future growth of energy production. The short story is that the energy use on Earth at present, in the early 21st century, as I speak, is already many times the threshold that Kardashev identified as the threshold of a Type 1 civilization in his 1964 paper. Kardashev gives his energy figures in erg seconds, which is unusual, so it's easy to gloss over comparisons with other formulations. For example, Carl Sagan gives his formulation in watts instead of erg seconds. In any case, our energy production and consumption is far greater than it was when Putnam wrote his book, and far greater than it was when Kardashev wrote his paper. But a Type 1 civilization is just the baseline, and no particular emphasis is given to it in Kardashev's paper. The meat of the paper is when Kardashev discusses the potential for Type 2 and Type 3 civilizations for transmitting information. Kardashev wrote, quote, "Should there exist even one Type 2 civilization within the confines of the local system of galaxies, there will be a realistic possibility of securing an enormous quantity of information. The same holds for the existence of even one single Type 3 civilization in the portion of the universe accessible to observation," unquote. Kardashev allows that a type 1 civilization might receive signals from a type 2 or type 3 civilization since it can at least build a radio telescope and listen for these signals, but whether it could reply is doubtful. The real distinction here is between type 2 civilizations, which are visible within the local group, or at most within the local cluster, and type 3 civilizations, which are visible throughout the observable universe. A type 3 civilization would radiate as brightly as a quasar, and we could literally see it on the other side of the universe. If there were a type 3 civilization in our universe, we would know about it. And in fact, one of the early quasars to be identified, designated CTA 102, Kardashev suggested might be a SETI signal. This was briefly a pop cultural sensation in the mid-60s, and the Byrds wrote a song titled CTA 102. In any case, the Kardashev civilization types are all about radio astronomy and the search for SETI signals, or if you prefer, technosignatures. This is the scale on which radio astronomy operates, and it's a very large scale. A large scale is also an abstract scale. It's an overview that elides most detail. If you look at civilizations only in terms of the energy they harness, you're abstracting from everything else. Most civilizations are going to look the same from this perspective, and you're only going to be making distinctions on a grand scale, which is what Kardashev's civilization types are, distinctions among civilizations on a grand scale. Kardashev cosmological civilizations on a grand scale he calls super civilizations. In his 1985 paper on the inevitability and possible structures of super civilizations, he explicitly formulated a couple of theses on super civilizations, which are these. 1. The scales of activity of any civilization are restricted only by natural and scientific factors. This assertion implies that all processes observed in nature, from phenomena in the microcosmos to those in the macrocosmos and all the way to the whole universe, may in time be utilized by civilizations, be reproduced, or even somewhat changed, though of course always in accordance with the laws of nature. 2. Civilizations have no inner inherent limitations on the scales of their activities. This implies that presumptions of a possible self-destruction of a civilization or of a certain restriction on the level of its development are not factual. Actually, several social conflicts may in fact be resolved, while civilizations will always face problems that demand larger scales of activity. It is this approach to the problem that seems most consistent with our current concepts. So those are Kardashev's two explicitly formulated theses on super civilizations. You can immediately see how different they are from Carl Sagan, who is always predicting the sudden and catastrophic end of civilization. But if Kardashev was right in his earlier definition of civilization in terms of it's using information to better adapt itself to its environment, we can certainly see how, as he says here, civilizations will always face problems that will demand larger scales of activity. So you're always taking in this information, but then you're always working it out and readapting it to your civilization and then expanding your civilization. And then if you keep doing that, you become a super civilization. For Kardashev, then, there are no upper bounds for super civilizations other than the bounds imposed by what he called natural and scientific factors. I imagine that the size of the universe itself is one such upper bound, not intrinsic to civilization, but a contingent limitation imposed by nature nevertheless. Part of the value of explicitly stated theses like this, especially when they are stated as categorically as Kardashev states these, is that these theses can serve as a stalking horse for contrary views. It's been said that the Drake equation is a container for ignorance. And Kardashev's postulates for the limits of civilization, or rather the unlimited nature of super civilizations, are also a container for our ignorance of the structure and distribution of civilizations in the cosmos. We could run through a number of thought experiments about civilizations expanding on a cosmological scale, and in thinking it through, we might stumble on limitations that we subsequently come to see as inherent in the nature of civilization itself. This seems to me to be much more likely than not, since we know so little about civilization, which I have many times called seriously under-theorized. An appreciation of Kardashev's contribution to the study of civilization, motivated both by a natural scientific methodology and an interest in technological signature searches, could help us in formulating both a naturalistic conception of civilization and a naturalistic conception of history. But to do this, we have to actually read Kardashev and not just invoke his civilization types as a thought-terminating cliche. So happy birthday, Nikolai Kardashev, and thanks for listening.